She only bought a small house for $500, thinking it would be her quiet retreat. But when she lifted the old floor and went down, she saw something that took her breath away. This discovery not only shocked the neighbors, but also changed her life forever. Subscribe to the channel, hit the like button, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. The city had never been kind to Lauren. It swallowed people whole, chewed them down into fragments of their dreams, and left them scattered among the endless traffic, the neon haze, and the pressure of bills that never seemed to stop arriving in the mailbox. She had spent most of her adult life there, in an apartment that overlooked a busy intersection where the sound of horns and sirens blurred into her nights, stealing even the small luxury of sleep. For years, she had told herself that things would get better, that she would find peace once her career stabilized, once her marriage settled, once the chaos around her began to quiet. But it never did. Instead, the years piled up, one disappointment after another, and by the time she reached 35, Lauren was divorced, burdened with debt, and tired in a way that seeped into her bones. The moment she stumbled across the advertisement for a house priced at only $500, she thought it had to be a mistake. A slip of the pen, a zero missing somewhere, or perhaps some cruel trick designed to bait desperate people like her. Yet she read the notice again and again, her eyes lingering on the words describing a small home on the outskirts of a rural town, miles away from everything she had ever known. There was a picture, grainy and faded, showing a little house with peeling white paint and a crooked fence, its windows dark as if it had been sleeping for years. Something about it tugged at her. Maybe it was the price, absurd and impossible, but maybe it was also the whisper of a chance, one final opportunity to escape the life that had been suffocating her. She called the number, half expecting no one to answer. Instead, a weary voice on the other end gave her an address, a date, and instructions for the paperwork. Everything felt strangely easy, too easy, but her desperation had sharpened into resolve. Within a week, she had boarded a bus that carried her out of the city and across miles of countryside where the air grew clearer and the horizon opened like a promise she had long forgotten. The town where the house was located was small, the kind of place that seemed suspended in time. Its main street was lined with brick buildings, many of them empty or shuttered, while the few that remained open displayed faded signs for diners, hardware stores, and thrift shops. The people were quiet, their gazes curious yet restrained as Lauren walked through, suitcase in hand. When she mentioned the address of the house, some faces stiffened, others quickly turned away. A pair of elderly women lowered their voices and whispered, glancing at her as if she had stepped into something she was not meant to touch. She pretended not to notice, though unease stirred in her chest. The house itself stood at the end of a narrow road bordered by trees that bent inward, their branches forming a canopy that filtered the light. From a distance, it looked like nothing more than an abandoned cottage, and its roof sagging slightly, its paint stripped away by rain and time. The fence leaned in awkward angles, one gate hanging loose as if no hand had touched it in years. But as she walked closer, something softened in her. The house was small, yes, but it had a charm hidden beneath its weariness. It was the kind of place she could imagine waking in on quiet mornings, listening to the rustle of leaves instead of honking horns. The real estate agent met her there, a man who seemed more interested in finishing the transaction quickly than explaining the house's history. The paperwork was already prepared, and for once in her life, the lack of complications worked in her favor. No bank loans, no endless signatures, no suspicious inspections. She handed over her $500, half of what she had saved from selling her furniture in the city, and with a stroke of a pen, the house became hers. That evening, when she carried her suitcase inside and stood in the small living room, she was struck by the silence. It was not the empty silence of loneliness, but a deep, surrounding stillness that pressed against her ears, almost sacred. The air smelled of dust and old wood. Sunlight poured through the cracked window panes, illuminating motes that swirled lazily before her eyes. The floor creaked under her feet, the boards worn smooth by footsteps of lives long gone. She wandered from room to room, exploring. There were only a few. A living room with faded wallpaper that curled at the corners, a small kitchen with rusted fixtures, a bedroom where the ceiling sloped downward, and a bathroom that smelled faintly of mildew. Every corner whispered of neglect, yet none of it felt hostile. She could already imagine scrubbing the walls, painting over the weariness, planting flowers by the fence. This house might not have been much to anyone else, but to her it was possibility. It was freedom. Still, as night fell and shadows stretched across the walls, she could not ignore the flicker of unease. The creak of the floorboards grew louder in the quiet, echoing as though the house remembered footsteps from another time. The wind slipped through cracks in the window frame, carrying a cool draft that brushed her skin like unseen fingers. She told herself it was only age, only wood settling after years of abandonment, but she could not shake the sensation that the house was watching her, waiting for something. She made herself a simple meal from the few groceries she had bought in town and ate by candlelight, since the electricity sputtered uncertainly. The flickering flame cast shifting patterns on the walls, and in those moments she felt both comforted and unsettled. When she finally lay down on the old mattress left in the bedroom, exhaustion pulled her into sleep. Yet even in dreams she felt the presence of the house around her, like a living thing breathing slowly in the dark. The next morning, she awoke to sunlight spilling across her face. For the first time in years, she had slept through the night without the interruptions of sirens or arguments from neighboring apartments. A fragile smile touched her lips. Maybe, just maybe, she had made the right choice. She sat on the porch with a cup of instant coffee and watched the trees sway in the breeze, their leaves whispering secrets to one another. It was peaceful, almost idyllic, yet somewhere deep inside her lingered the memory of the townspeople's glances, the way they had avoided speaking of the house. She wondered what stories they might have told, what memories lingered in these walls. As she rose to begin the first day of cleaning, she felt a strange resolve harden within her. Whatever secrets this little house held, they now belonged to her as well. And though she did not yet know it, that decision, to embrace the silence, the mystery, the chance for a new beginning, would change her life forever. Lauren awoke on her second morning in the little house to the sound of birdsong. It was such a delicate, unfamiliar noise compared to the background cacophony of her former apartment that she lay in bed for a while, letting it wash over her. The air smelled fresher here, tinged with the earthy scent of dew on the ground and the faint mustiness that always accompanied old wood. When she finally rose, she padded across the creaking floorboards and stood at the window, gazing out at the trees that hemmed in the property. Sunlight dappled the grass, turning the blades into strands of gold. For the first time in longer than she could remember, she felt a sense of peace. She began her first true day of settling into the house with determination. There was much to be done. Dust clung stubbornly to every surface, cobwebs stretched between corners like thin, ghostly curtains, and the faded wallpaper seemed to sigh under the weight of years. She found herself almost relishing the work. Scrubbing and wiping became a rhythm, a physical act that kept her mind from wandering to old regrets. She hummed softly as she pushed an old broom across the wooden floor, sending clouds of dust swirling upward into the shafts of light. Each sweep of her hand revealed more of the house's bones: wood that had once been warm and polished, wallpaper that might once have been cheerful. The effort made her sweat, but it was satisfying. This house was hers, and each act of cleaning felt like a claim, a declaration that she belonged here now. Yet, even in those first hours, oddities began to press against the edges of her awareness. The floor creaked in peculiar rhythms, not just beneath her own weight, but in places across the room where no one stood. Once, while wiping down a window, she heard what she thought was a muffled thump beneath her feet, so faint she almost dismissed it. She stilled, listening hard, but the sound did not return. Shrugging it off, she returned to work, though a faint unease lingered. By midday, she discovered traces of the lives that had once passed through the house. In a drawer in the kitchen, beneath a scatter of rusted cutlery, she found a stack of letters, their ink faded to brown, the paper curled and brittle at the edges. She did not read them yet. Something about the intimacy of the words felt too fragile to disturb. In the bedroom closet, she uncovered a broken toy horse, its paint chipped but its wooden form surprisingly intact, as if it had been waiting decades for a child's hand to grasp it again. These remnants were silent testimonies, fragments of forgotten days. They gave the house a personality, a sense of depth beyond its empty rooms. As evening drew near, Lauren grew weary. She lit a few candles, since the electricity sputtered unreliably. The house flickered alive in the shifting glow, shadows dancing along the walls in ways that unsettled her. She ate a simple meal at the kitchen table, listening to the chorus of night insects outside the window. It should have been calming, yet her ears strained for other sounds. At one point, she thought she heard the faint scrape of wood against wood, as if a chair were shifting slightly in the living room, but when she walked there, the room was still. That night, sleep did not come easily. The silence of the countryside was profound, heavy in a way she had never known. She lay in the dark, listening to the creaks of the house. Each groan of the wood seemed magnified in the absence of traffic and sirens. Around midnight, she startled awake, sure that she had heard a series of soft taps coming from below the floorboards. She sat up, her breath shallow, ears straining. Again, silence. She tried to reassure herself it was nothing more than the house adjusting to the cool night air, old wood shrinking and shifting with the temperature. Still, she left the lamp burning by her bed until exhaustion finally claimed her. The following day, as she continued her cleaning, she noticed something peculiar about the living room. The boards near the center seemed to vibrate faintly when she walked over them, more than the rest of the floor. She knelt and pressed her palm against the wood. Yes, there it was. A subtle tremor, almost like a heartbeat, faint but persistent. She frowned, puzzled, and ran her hand across the boards, searching for a draft or a crack. She found nothing obvious. And yet, when she stood, she felt a coolness brush her ankles, as though a thread of air had risen from below. Later that afternoon, while clearing cobwebs near the staircase, she encountered the same cold draft, slipping through the gaps in the wall as if from some unseen source. It raised goosebumps on her arms, even though the day was warm. She stood still, the broom in her hand, listening for the sound of wind, but the trees outside were motionless. A strange shiver passed through her, though she quickly forced herself to continue. By the third night, the noises became undeniable. She was dozing when a sound like footsteps passed faintly below her, measured and deliberate. Her heart hammered in her chest. She crept from her bed, gripping the flashlight she kept by her side, and tiptoed through the hallway. The beam of light cut across the peeling wallpaper, revealing only emptiness. She descended the creaking stairs, her breath shallow, but the house was still, save for the hum of the wind outside. No intruder, no footsteps, only her imagination, perhaps, sharpened by solitude. She forced a laugh at her own nerves, yet the fear did not leave her. During the day, she tried to ignore these sensations, burying herself in work. She scrubbed the kitchen tiles until her knuckles ached, patched the fence outside with boards she had scavenged, and pulled weeds from the yard. Each task gave her a sense of control, but beneath it all she knew the house was not done revealing itself. The drafts, the vibrations, the whispers of sound, they pressed on her mind, insistent and unexplainable. One evening, after a long day's labor, she sat on the porch as the sun set, watching the sky flush pink and gold. For a moment, she let herself believe that everything would be fine, that the house was simply old and quirky, no different from any other structure abandoned for too long. Yet, when she stepped back inside, the air felt heavier, charged with a weight she could not name. The silence was deeper now, as if the house were holding its breath. She lay awake late into the night, staring at the ceiling. Despite her fatigue, she could not dismiss the sensation that something lingered beneath her, something alive in the silence. And as she drifted uneasily toward sleep, one thought echoed in her mind. The townspeople had avoided speaking about this house for a reason. Lauren had bought the little home for only $500, and though she had come seeking peace, she began to suspect she had instead stepped into a mystery that would not let her go. The unease that had crept into Lauren's nights refused to let her go. By the end of her first week in the house, she had grown used to the creaks of the floor and the shifting of shadows on the walls, yet the sense of being watched did not fade. Instead, it thickened like fog around her shoulders. She told herself over and over that this was only a matter of adjusting, that anyone who moved from a city of millions to a house wrapped in silence would feel something similar. Still, she could not silence the chill that rose in her spine whenever the cool draft whispered against her ankles, or when the vibration beneath the floor pulsed faintly, as if the house itself breathed. She worked to exhaust herself each day with endless cleaning, repairs, and yard work, hoping that fatigue would silence her imagination. Yet, no matter how hard she tried, the house seemed to whisper its secrets at night. One morning, after a particularly restless night filled with half-dreamed footsteps below her bed, she decided to rearrange the living room. It was not so much a plan as a compulsion. The placement of the furniture, left by some long-ago occupant, felt wrong to her. The heavy old sofa sagged in the corner beneath a window, blocking the light. An enormous oak cabinet leaned against the wall near the stairs, dominating the room in a way that made her uncomfortable. She tugged at it half-heartedly, telling herself that at the very least she could sweep behind it. The cabinet resisted, its wooden legs dragging against the floor with a groan. She braced herself, heaved, and with a final effort managed to inch it away from the wall. Dust rose in a choking cloud, filling her nostrils and eyes until she coughed and stepped back. As the air cleared, her gaze fixed on the wall behind the cabinet. For a moment, she could not make sense of what she saw. The wallpaper, yellowed and peeling, bore strange lines beneath it, faint outlines that did not match the plaster's usual seams. She wiped at the surface with her sleeve and the dust came away, revealing a rectangle, tall and narrow, Her heart began to thud in her chest. She pressed her hand against it. The hollow sound that echoed back confirmed her suspicion. This was no ordinary wall. There was a door here. Lauren stood frozen, her hand lingering against the faded paper. The outline seemed to pulse beneath her fingertips, alive with the promise of hidden things. She should have stepped away, told herself that she was imagining it, that it was nothing more than an old repair job covered clumsily. But deep down, she knew the truth. This was why she had felt the vibrations, why the air had carried that icy breath. There was space behind this wall, a space that someone had not wanted her to find. Her first impulse was fear. The rational part of her whispered that sealed doors existed for a reason, that opening one could unleash trouble better left undisturbed. Yet another part of her, stronger, insistent, urged her on. She had come here for a new beginning, and perhaps this secret was meant for her. For long minutes she stood, staring at the outline, her pulse racing, until finally she snatched a knife from the kitchen drawer and returned. With trembling hands, she slid the blade beneath the peeling edge of the wallpaper. The paper tore away with a dry rip, curling in her hands. Beneath it lay the rough surface of a wooden door, its grain darkened with age, the outline now undeniable. The door was small, narrow, not quite tall enough for her to pass through without stooping. At its center hung a rusted iron handle. The metal was cold to her touch, so cold that it stung her palm. She hesitated again, listening. The house was utterly silent, as if waiting. She tried the handle, but it resisted, locked by time. She pressed her shoulder against it, pushing, but it would not budge. Determined now, driven by a strange mixture of terror and exhilaration, she returned to the cabinet and rummaged until she found a loose piece of iron, a broken hinge that could serve as leverage. Wedging it against the frame, she forced the door. With a shriek of protest, the rusted latch gave way, the wood splintering slightly. The door swung open an inch, then another, until finally it gaped before her. From the darkness beyond rose a breath of cold air that carried the scent of stone, dust, and something else. Something older, earthier, as though the past itself exhaled into her face. She recoiled instinctively, but curiosity dragged her forward. She lifted her flashlight, its thin beam piercing the blackness. There, beyond the threshold, lay a narrow staircase of stone descending steeply into the earth. The steps were uneven, worn smooth in places, their edges rounded by countless treads of feet long gone. The walls surrounding the stairwell were rough, carved directly into the earth, lined here and there with old timbers that groaned softly as if remembering their purpose. Lauren's breath caught. She had expected perhaps a storage space, a crawl space, a forgotten closet. But this was something else entirely. A stairwell meant a destination, a chamber, a hidden place that someone had sealed away deliberately. For a long moment, she remained rooted at the threshold, the beam of her flashlight trembling as her hand shook. Fear surged inside her. She imagined what could lurk below, vermin, rot, or worse. Yet, mingled with the fear was an undeniable thrill. It felt as though she stood at the entrance to a story, as though her life, once filled with monotony and disappointment, had suddenly veered into something vast and unknown. She swallowed hard, trying to calm her racing heart. The cold draft coiled around her ankles, urging her downward. She thought of the townspeople's evasive glances, the way their voices had dropped when she mentioned the house. They had known. They had known there was something here. And now she stood on the brink of it. Lauren lowered herself to sit on the floor, her legs trembling, trying to summon courage. Her flashlight beam wavered down the stairs, glinting on the rough stone. She could almost hear something waiting in the silence, some presence below. At last she rose to her feet, her decision made. She would not turn back. She would not let fear rob her of whatever truth this house concealed. With one final breath, she stepped onto the first stone stair. The wood of the door creaked behind her as if sighing in relief, as though it, too, had been waiting centuries for someone to cross its threshold. And so, with the beam of light cutting a fragile path through the dark, Lauren began her descent into the hidden depths of the house, unaware that with each step she was leaving behind not just the safety of her new beginning, but the life she had thought she knew. The air grew colder with every step Lauren took, the chill wrapping around her like an invisible cloak as she descended into the narrow passage. The stone steps seemed carved by hands long gone, worn and uneven under her weight. Her flashlight cast trembling beams against the rough walls, revealing streaks of moisture glistening like veins. The silence was profound, broken only by the sound of her own breath echoing back at her, louder than she expected in the confined space. She had left behind the familiar creaks of the wooden house above, and now she felt as though she had stepped into a different world entirely, a world sealed off from the ordinary passage of time. Her pulse hammered in her chest as she reached the bottom of the stairs. The beam of light swung across a heavy wooden door, broader than the one she had forced open upstairs, reinforced with rusted iron bands. The door loomed before her, ancient and scarred, yet still intact despite what must have been decades, even centuries of neglect. For a moment, she simply stood, her hand trembling on the flashlight, gathering the courage to push it open. Every instinct warned her to turn back, but another voice, steady and persistent, urged her onward. She had not come this far to surrender to fear. She pressed her shoulder against the door and shoved. It resisted at first, the wood groaning under her weight, then gave way with a sharp crack, swinging inward on hinges that shrieked in protest. The sound echoed down unseen corridors, bouncing back at her until it seemed as though the earth itself was groaning awake. She stepped across the threshold, her flashlight cutting into the darkness beyond. The sight stole her breath. Before her stretched a chamber vast enough to swallow the little house above. The walls were lined with towering shelves carved directly into the stone, filled with objects that caught the beam of her light. Piles of crates and chests sat stacked in the corners, some broken open, spilling their contents like secrets begging to be told. The floor was littered with fragments of parchment, crumbled wood, and dust that rose in a shimmering haze when disturbed. It was a hidden library, an archive, a vault of forgotten history preserved beneath her feet. Lauren stepped forward in awe, her fear momentarily eclipsed by wonder. The shelves nearest to her were filled with books, their spines cracked, their covers worn but still legible in the golden letters embossed long ago. She reached out a hand and brushed her fingers against one. The leather crumbled slightly under her touch, yet the title gleamed faintly in the light. It was written in a language she did not recognize, ornate and curling like vines across the surface. She set it back reverently, her heart pounding with a mixture of dread and exhilaration. Her light swung towards the tables scattered around the room. On one lay a collection of maps, their edges frayed, the ink faded to sepia tones. She bent to look closer, realizing they were not simple maps of land or trade routes, but something else entirely. Networks of tunnels, pathways that seemed to weave beneath towns and forests. The realization made her shiver. Perhaps this place had not only been a library but also a meeting ground, a place where plans were made in secret, hidden from the world above. In another corner, she discovered objects gleaming beneath a thin layer of dust. A set of ornate candlesticks, tarnished but elegant, stood beside a chest partially ajar, filled with silver coins that caught the light. Nearby rested an assortment of weapons, blades, daggers, even an old musket, each one bearing the marks of use. They were relics, artifacts that spoke of lives lived in conflict and survival. As she moved deeper into the chamber, Lauren's sense of awe grew heavier, tinged now with something closer to reverence. The air itself seemed thick with memory. She felt as though she had intruded into a sanctum, a place where time had been carefully preserved. Her footsteps echoed softly, respectful despite herself, as though she feared disturbing the silence too much. Her flashlight revealed markings on the walls, etched symbols that curled like ancient scripts. She traced them with her fingers, feeling the grooves cut deep into the stone. Some looked like initials, others like unfamiliar sigils. She could not decipher them, but they radiated purpose. Whoever had created this chamber had not only stored objects here, they had imbued it with meaning. She stopped before a large wooden chest in the center of the room. Its iron lock had long since rusted through, leaving the lid slightly ajar. She hesitated, then lifted it with both hands. Inside lay bundles of papers wrapped in cloth, their edges yellowed with time. She carefully unwrapped one, revealing handwritten pages covered in looping script. The ink was faded but still legible, though the words were in a language she could not read. She turned page after page, feeling the fragile paper threaten to crumble. The weight of it struck her then, not just the paper, but the story behind it. These were not ordinary belongings. They were fragments of forgotten lives, preserved as if waiting for her to uncover them. She sat on the edge of a cracked chair, one of the few pieces of furniture still intact, and let her eyes roam the chamber. Everywhere she looked, the room whispered of secrets. Each book, each artifact seemed to carry with it a ghost, a silent witness to events that had shaped people long before she was born. She imagined those who had once stood where she sat now, men and women bent over tables, whispering in the dim glow of candlelight, planning, preserving, hiding. She imagined footsteps echoing on the very floor beneath her, the murmur of voices sworn to silence, the quick scratching of pens capturing words meant never to be lost. Her awe deepened into unease. The longer she lingered, the more the chamber seemed to press in on her, the silence thickening until it felt alive. She set the bundle of papers back in the chest and rose, shining her light into the farthest corners. There were areas her beam could not reach, where darkness clung stubbornly, resisting intrusion. For a moment, she thought she saw movement there, a flicker of shadow not her own, and her heart leapt into her throat. But when she swung the light again, the corner was still. She forced herself to breathe slowly, to calm the rising panic. She could not let her imagination seize control. This place was extraordinary, a discovery that would change everything. And yet, as she stood in the center of the chamber, she felt an undeniable weight, as though the secrets around her were not only treasures, but burdens. Reluctantly, she made her way back to the staircase. The beam of her flashlight swept across the chamber one last time, illuminating the shelves, the maps, the relics that had waited in silence for so long. She knew she could not leave it untouched, not now that she had seen it. This cellar was not just a curiosity. It was history itself, hidden beneath the skin of her $500 home. And with that knowledge came responsibility she had not anticipated. As she began her climb back toward the narrow door above, the cold draft followed her, curling at her back like a reminder. She emerged into the living room, breathless and trembling, closing the hidden door behind her with a force that made the old wood rattle. Leaning against it, she pressed her forehead to the frame, her mind spinning. She had found something no one else had spoken of, something deliberately hidden away, and though she was back in the ordinary world of dusty wallpaper and sagging ceilings, the memory of that vast, secret chamber clung to her like a second skin. She knew she would return. The cellar had called to her, and it would not let her go. Sleep evaded Lauren after that first descent into the cellar. She tossed in her narrow bed, staring at the ceiling where shadows crawled like living things, her mind replaying the images she had seen below. The towering shelves of books, the ancient maps with their cryptic paths, the rusted weapons laid out like the remains of long-forgotten battles. All of it pressed against her thoughts until she could no longer tell if she was awake or dreaming. She felt the house breathing around her, every creak and sigh now infused with meaning. It was no longer just a place to live. It had become a threshold to something vast and hidden, something she was now responsible for. By the time dawn lightened the edges of the window, she rose with determination. She could not ignore what lay beneath her feet. The cellar had revealed itself to her, and though fear still clung like a shadow, the greater part of her burned with a need to know. She prepared herself as best she could, gathering a sturdier flashlight, a notebook, and gloves to protect the fragile pages she had glimpsed. The house groaned softly as she moved, as if aware of her intentions, and when she pulled the narrow hidden door open once again, the same cool breath of air greeted her like a summons. She descended carefully, each step echoing in the silence. When she reached the chamber, she switched on the flashlight, sweeping its beam slowly across the shelves and tables. The dust swirled in the air, disturbed by her presence, and for a moment she felt as though she were intruding into a sacred temple. Her eyes fell upon the chest she had opened before, the bundle of handwritten pages still resting within. She crouched beside it, her gloved hands trembling as she lifted them again. This time, she examined them more closely, noting the ink strokes that varied in thickness, the flourish of letters crafted by hands long gone. She could not decipher the words. They belonged to another tongue entirely, but she could feel the weight of intent behind them. She placed the pages gently aside and turned to the shelves. Many of the books bore titles she could not read, their spines gilded with symbols and scripts unfamiliar to her. Others, however, were written in languages she recognized, though archaic in form. She pulled one volume free and opened it carefully, marveling at the browned pages. It was a ledger, filled with names and dates, each entry meticulously inscribed. Some names carried small marks beside them, crosses or circles, perhaps denoting deaths, escapes, or achievements. As she turned the pages, she realized the ledger stretched back centuries, the earliest date older than her country itself. Her heart raced. These were not simply books, they were records, chronicles of lives that history had not preserved in any classroom or textbook. She imagined the people whose names filled those pages, men and women who had struggled, fled, hidden, and survived. Their stories had been left here, buried under dust and stone, entrusted to silence. Now she was the first to read them in generations. Moving from shelf to shelf, she discovered more. Journals filled with the personal reflections, maps marked with secret trails that seemed to crisscross territories she half recognized. Some documents bore seals, official crests long obsolete, their wax still faintly visible. Others were letters, folded carefully and tied with faded ribbon. She dared not untie them yet, fearing they might crumble in her hands. The deeper she ventured into the chamber, the more the weight of history pressed upon her. She paused before a table where a collection of objects had been arranged deliberately, as though for study. There was a small iron key, ornate in its carving, beside a diary whose leather cover was scarred by fire. Next to it lay a pair of manacles, rusted through, their links fused together by age. Lauren stared at them, her chest tightening. They were too small to belong to a grown man. They had once bound a child. She touched them only briefly before pulling her hand away, shivering as though the cold metal had burned her. She sat heavily on a nearby chair, her flashlight beam trailing across the chamber. The implications grew clearer with each discovery. This was not just a library or a hoard of valuables. It was a vault of stories deliberately concealed, stories tied to suffering, struggle, and survival. She thought of her own ancestors, of the long and painful history woven into her blood. Could these relics have belonged to people like them, their voices preserved in secret because the world above had refused to listen? Her mind filled with questions. Who had created this archive? Was it the work of a single family, carefully preserving its history across generations? Or had it been a collective effort, a secret society determined to safeguard knowledge others sought to erase? The maps of hidden trails gnawed at her thoughts, suggesting networks of escape and resistance. The letters and diaries whispered of lives that had fought against silence. She rose again, driven by urgency. She could not keep this to herself, not if it was what she suspected. She needed help, someone who could decipher the languages, authenticate the documents, and confirm the history. But even as the thought formed, unease pressed against her. Trust was dangerous. She remembered the wary glances of the townspeople, the way they had avoided speaking of the house. Some had known there was something here, or at least suspected. If she reached out to the wrong person, the secret might vanish into private collections or be destroyed entirely. Still, she could not bear the thought of leaving the cellar locked in silence once more. She began cataloging what she could in her notebook, sketching the symbols carved into the walls, noting the placement of chests and tables. Her handwriting shook as she filled page after page, the beam of her flashlight her only companion. Hours passed unnoticed as she moved from one artifact to the next, drawn deeper into the web of history. At last, exhausted, she returned the items carefully to their places and closed the chest. She ascended the stone stairs slowly, each step heavy with the weight of what she carried now, not in her hands, but in her mind. Back in the dim light of her living room, she shut the hidden door and leaned against it, pressing her forehead to the wood as she had before. This time, her thoughts were sharper, more defined. She knew without doubt that she had uncovered something monumental. The rest of the evening she spent pacing the floor, her notebook clutched to her chest. She considered calling someone immediately, perhaps a university historian or a museum curator. Yet fear held her back. The discovery was fragile, and so was her trust. She imagined strangers arriving, their hands greedy, their eyes sharp. She imagined the cellar stripped bare, its secrets scattered or sold. The idea filled her with dread. Instead, she resolved to choose carefully. She would find someone who understood, someone who could appreciate not just the value of the objects but the meaning behind them. She would protect the cellar until she was certain of the right path forward. For now, the secret remained hers alone, and though it weighed heavily on her, it also filled her with a sense of purpose she had never known. That night, as she lay awake listening to the sighs of the old house, Lauren felt a strange kinship with the silence around her. She was no longer merely a tenant of the home, nor even its owner. She was its guardian now, bound to it by the secrets it had chosen to reveal. She had stepped into history itself, and history had accepted her. Lauren's decision to guard the secret of the cellar did not last long. For several days, she lived in a state of restless vigilance, pacing the house at night, her notebook never far from her reach. The pages she had filled with sketches and notes lay stacked on her table, silent proof of what she had seen below. Each time she leafed through them, she felt the same electric thrill of discovery, yet also a deep unease, for she knew she was holding evidence of something that could change her life in ways she had not yet imagined. At first, she thought she could keep it to herself until she had the strength to decide what to do, but secrecy became unbearable. The weight of it pressed against her chest until she could hardly breathe. On the fourth morning, she resolved to reach out. She needed a witness, someone who could confirm that what she had uncovered was real, not some fever dream conjured by loneliness and imagination. She searched the town records, scanning the sparse local newspaper, and eventually found the name of a historian affiliated with a nearby university. His work focused on regional history, with particular interest in early settlements and underground movements. It seemed safe enough. She wrote down his number, hesitated for an hour, then dialed. Her voice shook as she explained what she had found, though she cloaked her words carefully, avoiding too much detail. She mentioned the existence of old documents and artifacts in a cellar beneath her house, suggesting they might be of historical interest. There was a pause on the line, followed by the sound of quickened breath. The historian's tone changed instantly from polite detachment to sharp curiosity. He asked her address, promised to come at once, and within a day his car pulled up at the crooked gate of her $500 home. Lauren watched him step out, a tall man with graying hair and spectacles that slipped down his nose. He carried a satchel and an expression that shifted from skepticism to awe as soon as she let him inside. She guided him to the hidden door, her own hands trembling as she opened it again. The cool draft whispered upward, curling around them, and she saw his eyes widen with recognition that this was no ordinary discovery. Together they descended the stone steps. The historian stopped short when the chamber revealed itself, his gaze sweeping across the shelves, the relics, the scattered parchments. He whispered something reverent under his breath, then moved forward, running his fingers gently along the spines of the books. He pulled one free, examined its title, and his face blanched. "This is extraordinary," he murmured, his voice nearly lost in the silence. He opened another, gasped, and turned to her, his eyes shining. "Do you have any idea what you've uncovered?" Lauren only shook her head, afraid to speak. For the next 2 hours he moved from table to table, crouching over maps, examining coins and weapons, carefully lifting diaries and letters with the air of a man who had stumbled into a miracle. Each discovery brought another exclamation, another look of disbelief. He explained fragments to her, pointing out dates from the 16th century, seals from governments that no longer existed, symbols tied to secret networks. He spoke of the Underground Railroad, of resistance groups, of histories long whispered but rarely documented. He told her some of these artifacts could be worth thousands, even millions. By the time they climbed back into the living room, the air between them felt heavy. Lauren's heart pounded with conflicting emotions, relief that her discovery was real, terror at the immensity of what it meant. She served him tea at the kitchen table, watching as he scribbled notes furiously. He urged her to keep the cellar locked, to let no one else near it, not until further study could be arranged. His eyes shone with excitement, but beneath it she glimpsed something else, a flicker of hunger she could not quite name. That night she lay awake again, unable to sleep. The historian's words circled in her head, mingling with the image of his eager hands leafing through the books. She wanted to believe he would help her protect the archive, but doubt gnawed at her. Knowledge of this magnitude was dangerous. It could elevate her, yes, but it could also ruin her. Her fears proved justified sooner than she expected. Within a week, strangers began arriving in town. She noticed them while buying groceries, unfamiliar faces lingering too long, eyes watching her with sharp interest. One afternoon, she returned to find muddy footprints near her fence, as if someone had walked the perimeter of her property, circling like a predator. Another night, she woke to the sound of rattling at her back door, only to find nothing when she rushed down the stairs, her flashlight beam slicing through the dark. Rumors had spread. She could feel them in the way the townspeople looked at her now, not with suspicion alone, but with a kind of wary respect. Someone had talked. Perhaps the historian had shared word of the discovery, or perhaps the vibrations of gossip had simply traveled too fast in such a small place. Either way, secrecy was gone. The offers began discreetly. A man in a pressed suit approached her outside the general store, introducing himself as a collector of rare documents. He smiled too easily, his words dripping with flattery as he offered her a sum that made her dizzy. Another letter arrived in her mailbox with no signature, only the promise of payment if she was willing to part with what she had found. Lauren tore it up, her hands shaking. Each offer left her feeling more exposed, more vulnerable. And then came the threats. One evening, she found her gate smashed open, the wood splintered as if struck deliberately. Another time, she discovered a stone hurled through her porch window, a crude note tied to it warning her not to be foolish. Fear crept into every corner of her days. She began locking the hidden door with makeshift chains, checking every window twice before bed. The cellar's treasures, once a source of wonder, now felt like a curse pressing against her chest. Yet, even in her fear, she could not consider abandoning it. This was history. This was truth. The weight of generations whispered from the pages below, demanding that she guard them. She realized now that she was not only the owner of a house, she had become a custodian of memory, entrusted with a legacy too important to fall into greedy hands. One night, sitting at her kitchen table with her notebook spread open, Lauren wept quietly, torn between dread and resolve. She thought of her ancestors, of the lives erased from records, and she knew she could not let this archive be lost. But how to protect it? She was only one woman, and the world outside was growing hungrier by the day. The house moaned softly in the night, its wooden bones creaking under invisible weight. She lifted her head and felt the silence pressing in. The cellar was waiting, as if aware of the threats circling above. For a moment, she thought she heard the faint echo of footsteps below, steady and patient, and though her heart raced, she drew strength from the sound. She had uncovered something extraordinary, and though the world now pressed against her door, demanding its share, she vowed to hold fast. She would not surrender. The cellar's secrets had chosen her, and she would protect them even if the price was more than she ever imagined. The night after the stone shattered her porch window, Lauren sat in the kitchen with her head cradled in her hands. The house felt smaller now, its walls pressing in with a weight that seemed heavier than the timber and plaster themselves. Every gust of wind rattling through the trees outside made her flinch. Every groan of the old floorboards carried the suggestion of an intruder. She had locked and bolted every door, chained the hidden entrance beneath the stairs, but her unease did not fade. The world outside knew what she had uncovered, and the world outside wanted to take it from her. The cellar had shifted from being a sanctuary of wonder to a fortress of secrets, and she, its reluctant guardian, stood at the center of a storm she had never imagined. She thought often of the historian who had been the first to see it with her. His excitement had seemed genuine, but the hunger in his eyes lingered in her memory. Had he been the one to spread word of her discovery, or had the rumor simply slipped free through the invisible channels of small towns, where nothing stayed hidden for long? She could not know for certain, but the result was the same. Strangers were circling her life now, people who looked at her not as a woman, but as a gatekeeper to a fortune. Days passed in uneasy rhythm. Offers grew larger, threats more pointed. One morning, she found a business card tucked beneath her front door, its embossed lettering promising confidential negotiations and maximum discretion. Another night, she woke to the sound of tires crunching slowly over gravel outside, headlights sweeping across her walls before fading into the distance. She realized then that she could not simply wait for the world to pass her by. She had to make a choice, one that would shape the rest of her life. The decision did not come easily. She spent long hours pacing the cellar, her flashlight beam lingering on the relics she had come to know like silent companions. Each book, each diary, each artifact whispered of lives lived in struggle, hope, and secrecy. The rusted manacles that had once bound a child, the maps that traced hidden paths beneath forests, the journals filled with voices silenced in official records. These things were priceless, not because of the money they might fetch, but because of the stories they carried. To sell them into private hands would be to silence those voices all over again. To hoard them for herself would be to fail the very people who had created them. And yet, to give them freely to the world meant opening herself to danger, losing control entirely. One evening, as dusk bled into night, Lauren sat on the porch with her notebook in her lap. The air was cool, carrying the scent of damp earth and pine, and in that stillness she thought of her own family. She thought of her grandmother's stories, half whispered at family gatherings about ancestors who had fled north under cover of darkness, guided by strangers who risked their lives to help them. She thought of names that had never made it into textbooks of courage unrecognized by history, and she realized then that the cellar was not just a burden. It was a gift, a responsibility, a chance to honor those whose stories had been hidden away. Her decision took form slowly, but once it settled in her heart, she felt a strange calm. She would not sell the archive to the highest bidder, nor would she leave it locked away in the dark. Instead, she would divide it carefully. Some of the artifacts she would donate to museums and universities, places where they could be studied and preserved, their stories shared with the world. Others she would keep, guarding them as a personal legacy, ensuring that not everything could be stolen or misused. It would be a balance between protection and revelation, between secrecy and truth. The process began quietly. She reached out to a curator she had once met during a school trip years ago, someone she trusted to value history above profit. Their voice trembled with awe when she described the collection, and they promised to come discreetly. In the weeks that followed, trusted experts visited her home under the cover of night, walking the narrow stairwell into the cellar with reverent silence. They handled the relics with gloved hands, their eyes shining as they confirmed their authenticity. Their estimates of value staggered her. Millions, they said, for the collection as a whole. But she waved the numbers aside. To her, the worth lay not in currency, but in legacy. Still, the money she received for the items she chose to sell was more than she had ever imagined. With it, she repaired the house from top to bottom. The sagging roof was replaced, the walls were painted fresh, the crooked fence rebuilt into a sturdy barrier. She planted flowers by the gate, their colors bright against the once faded yard, and filled the rooms with warmth and light. Where once the house had groaned with emptiness, now it seemed to hum with life, as though grateful for the transformation. But even as she enjoyed the comfort of her renewed home, Lauren never forgot the cellar below. She kept part of the archive hidden, sealed behind the wooden door that had first revealed itself to her. The journals, the maps, the diaries she could not bear to part with remained in her care. At night, she would descend the stairs, sitting by candlelight among the shelves, reading the fragments she could, whispering thanks to those who had left their voices behind. She felt their presence around her, not as ghosts to be feared, but as companions whose stories she was helping to keep alive. In time, the threats faded. Strangers stopped circling her property, the offers ceased arriving in her mailbox. The world moved on, satisfied with what pieces had been revealed, but Lauren remained, rooted in her little house that had cost only $500, her life transformed by what had been hidden beneath its floors. She knew she could never return to the woman she had been before, tired and aimless in a city that had drained her spirit. Now she carried purpose, a connection to history, and a sense of belonging she had never known. On quiet evenings, she would sit by the window, watching the sun set over the trees, the air alive with the hum of crickets and the whisper of leaves. In those moments, she felt the weight of both past and future pressing gently against her. She had been chosen, in some inexplicable way, to guard this secret and to share it. And she had answered the call. The house, once dismissed as worthless, had become her sanctuary, her legacy, her home. What began as a desperate purchase had blossomed into a life-altering journey, carrying her from fear to responsibility, from solitude to connection. She had uncovered not just a cellar, not just an archive, but a truth that pulsed like a heartbeat through the walls of her home. And as she closed her eyes each night, listening to the gentle creaks of the old wood, she knew she would never again be alone. The voices of history were with her, and she would carry them forward, as surely as the house itself carried her. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to hit that subscribe button so you don't miss the next incredible discovery. Watch our other videos for even more unbelievable true stories that will leave you speechless. And don't keep this to yourself. Share this video with your friends and family so they can experience it too.